Hey CW Apes, Mr. Kennedy here, and this is your Chapter 5 lecture on ecosystems and energy. Today, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this idea known as ecology. Ecology is something that's very near and dear to my heart. It's one of my favorite classes as an undergrad. Basically, we get to study in ecology the relationships between organisms and their non-living environment. So when you think about studying ecology, what you're really studying is eco, the house that you live in, right? So if we're studying an ecosystem, ecology, we're studying the house or the system in the house that we live in. That's how it works, okay? Within any ecological study, one of the first things we need to do is divide living things from non-living things. Those terms that you see here on this slide, biotic from abiotic, right? That will help you start to develop some order and organization to your field of study. Studying ecology opens the door to a world, literally a world of knowledge that needs to be organized and analyzed. How do we deal with all of that all at once? It's too much. So rather than try to do a full ecosphere study where we're looking at like the entire planet all at once, or even just an entire ecosystem all at once, which is a much smaller study, what we try to do is pick out the individual working parts of these things and study them one at a time and arrive at some larger conceptual ideas. If you remember my previous lecture where we talked about the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning, that line of thought should ring a bell for you. So in an ecosystem, there are some tiers or some levels of organization that I want you to be familiar with. The first tier, or the bottom tier, if we go from small to big, is a species. Species are all the organisms of the same kind that are genetically similar enough to breed in nature and produce fertile offspring. If the organisms will not breed in nature and produce fertile offspring, they're not considered a species. If the offspring produced are sterile, or if the only way you can get these individuals to breed is to force them in captivity or through artificial insemination, then they're not considered the same species. They would be different species. Okay? Populations. Populations are all the members of a species living in a given area at the same time. Okay? All the members of a species. So these individuals not only have to like look the same and be able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, but they got to be in the same place like at the same time. A biological community is all of the populations living and interacting in a particular area. So in a biological community, we're going to add more to this so that you have not just one species, one population, but now multiple species, multiple populations interacting to make a community. The largest tier is the ecosystem. So that takes everything that you just saw, the species, the population, the community, and adds to it the physical environment that all of these things are in. So now it's, all the individuals that can breed and produce fertile offspring in nature, right, in the same place at the same time, mixed in with other populations and the physical parts of the environment. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a massive amount of field work, okay? So sometimes it's easier to study the individual parts and then put them together for the greater whole. That's how ecosystems are broken down or tiered in terms of their levels of organization. Okay? Now, the next thing that we got to start dealing with in terms of organization is energy. So energy flows through ecosystems. How does it flow through an ecosystem? Well, if you remember, the ultimate source for energy on Earth is the sun. Plants photosynthesize, animals eat the plants. You know how that all works, right? Eventually that energy has to be transferred all the way down to the cellular level where all the chemical reactions for life occur. You should know a definition for cells by this point in your educational career, but in case you don't, here's one. They're minute compartments in a living organism which carry out life processes. And probably the most important parts of a cell when it comes to energy are enzymes. Enzymes are molecular catalysts that regulate the chemical reactions that occur in cells and help cells use whatever energy or fuel that they have as efficiently as possible. Remember, enzymes reduce the activation energy needed to make a reaction go. So at the end of the day, if you have enzymes, that's kind of like, driving a Prius, so you're getting more miles to the gallon for the fuel that you have. Metabolism is the sum total of all the enzymatic reactions that are being performed in these cells, and realistically, in order to survive, you want that metabolic process to be as efficient as possible. So here's just kind of a diagram of how that energy flows from plant all the way down to the cell, right? And then as we multiply that out, right, what I want you to get from this is just sort of, the building of a food chain or a food web. So this will show you not just the organization of, going through organism to population, community, ecosystem, and out to the earth, but deeper from atoms all the way through. And from this diagram, I want you to think of energy flow, right? Energy is moving from the atomic level, right, all the way up through an organism, through populations, through the whole community, the ecosystem, and potentially into outer space, right? Ecological studies spend a lot of time focused on energy and how efficiently it is used within an ecosystem. So let's dig a little deeper with regard to energy. So there's two terms relating to energy that I want you to know: gross primary productivity and net primary productivity. Your gross primary productivity is the total energy that is accumulated by plants through photosynthesis. Your net primary productivity is the energy that's left over after the plants use what they need for life, right? Another way to think about it in terms of money is gross is your profits, right? That you get from, selling whatever you're going to sell, right? That's all the money that comes in. But by the way, you've got some operating expenses, okay? So those operating expenses, those costs, that's going to take away from the gross of what you made by selling stuff. The end result, if we take our gross, our money in, we subtract our costs, that's going to leave us with profits. So when you think about energy in terms of life, gross primary productivity, that's your money in that you made from selling stuff. Cellular respiration, that's your costs. And whatever you're left with, that's your net primary productivity that, other animals maybe can take advantage of when they eat you, okay? There's some ways to calculate this and some practice problems that I'll have you do along the way. Here's an example. This is a bromeliad that produces 1,250 calories of energy and uses 750 calories of energy for growth. So very simple application of that equation. Your net primary productivity is equal to gross primary productivity minus R. So 1250 minus 750 leaves us with a net primary productivity of 500 calories. Okay? You never want to get to a situation where your net primary productivity is negative. Can anybody think of why? If your net primary productivity is negative, then that means you are using more energy than you're taking in, and if you know anything about economics, your business is bound to fail. Okay? So in terms of what ecosystems have the highest net primary productivity, I put this graph in here for you to consider. Look at the top. Estuaries, swamps, marshes, tropical rainforests, temperate forests, they're right up there at the top as having areas with the most net primary productivity. High productivity usually means you have a really healthy plant community, right? Low productivity means that there's some sort of stress going on. The plants, for whatever reason, are not thriving. So that's why measuring net primary productivity and focusing on energy and ecosystem studies becomes really, really important to an ecologist or us environmental scientists, because we want to know what kind of impact humans are having on an ecosystem, and we want to know what the health of the ecosystem is in order to protect it. Couple of other things to think about in terms of these ecosystems and the energy associated with them. So this is a chart that shows what's called an ecotone. An ecotone is the gap or space where two separate life zones overlap. Like here we have a land zone overlapping with an aquatic zone. Because two separate life zones, or ecosystems in this case, are overlapping, well, you have an intense concentration of plant and animal life, which basically means that the net primary productivity in these areas should be higher than either of the life zones adjacent to them considered on their own, right? And it kind of makes sense if you think about an ecotone here as an estuary or a marsh, right? And then you go back and you look at this graph. Estuaries, right? Swamps, marshes, they're way up there at the top. Because you've got water and land overlapping, you've got people, well, plants and animals, who can take advantage of the best of both worlds. Let's keep moving. Now, when you think about where plants and animals choose to live, it's not just all based on energy. There's lots of factors that play into it, and one of the things that I want you to consider is this: an organism's range of tolerance. The range of tolerance for a plant or an animal really can touch on all kinds of different ideology and different things. In this case, this is a graph of temperature and its impact on fish. So what you can see is if the temperature gets too high or too low, well, basically the fish are unhappy. And if we get to this optimum range, then the fish are happy, they reproduce, and the rest is history. Outside of this optimum range, there are two bars to consider. The first bar on the right and left is what we call a zone of physiological stress. So basically at that point, the population will start to suffer. The fish in this case will reproduce at a much less successful rate, but if we can get the temperature back into the optimum range relatively quickly after being in this physiological stress area, the population can recover. It's when we get into the zone of intolerance that we've got a problem. At the zone of intolerance, like, not even the strongest of the strong survive. All of the eggs fail to hatch. The healthy adults die. The older fish die at an earlier age. I mean, you're talking about a situation where things are so bad in terms of temperature, too cold, too hot, that everybody just dies. Again, you could potentially save this population, but you would have to really be quick. If we continue looking at this, here's another example of a range of tolerance. The range of tolerance basically for trout, carp, and bass varies significantly. If you look at this, right, you can see that there are specific temperature and oxygen concentrations that each of these fish prefer. So depending on what the temperature and oxygen concentration is in the stream that's flowing down there between those mountains, well, it'll really determine what fish lives where. The bass can't live in the freezing cold water that the trout like, and vice versa. The trout wouldn't really choose to or prefer to live someplace like where the bass is living, right? They don't often overlap. As we continue down this journey, and we dig again a little bit deeper with regard to energy, the energy that we see in an ecosystem should flow between the ecosystem components or compartments, if you will. Producers are the primary individual for harnessing solar energy and then basically passing it on to the rest of the ecosystem. So plants harvest the solar energy, and then herbivores eat them, and then carnivores eat the herbivores, right? And then when those carnivores die, like, they decompose, and then that produces nutrients that the plants can then absorb, but obviously at a much lower energy level. All along the way, heat is going to be lost. Okay, so what this means is ecosystem energy transfer really is not 100% efficient, and a lot of energy is lost out into the atmosphere and eventually into space. So it's really, really important that energy gets recycled, or replenished, I should say, from the sun every single day. Okay, how do we measure energy? Energy is measured in a unit called calories. 1 little c calorie is the amount of energy it takes to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. What's 1 gram of water? Well, it's about a drop. Okay, so 1 little c calorie is the amount of energy it takes to raise 1 drop of water 1 degree Celsius. The big C calories that we see on food labels and things like that, those are called kilocalories. A kilocalorie is 1,000 calories, right? So if you just like think of it this way, 1 kilocalorie could raise that like same drop of water like 1,000 degrees Celsius. That's a lot of juice, okay? A joule is basically, or 4.18 joules is equal to 1 calorie. That brings us to the laws of thermodynamics. Now, hopefully you remember these, but if not, like here they are in note form. The first law of thermodynamics basically says energy cannot be created nor destroyed. So there's no way for us to create energy. It simply just changes state or changes form one to the next. So when the sun's energy strikes the earth, like we're not creating energy in a plant. We're transferring that the solar energy into like the chemical bond energy between atoms. Like that's all there is to it. Super simple, super straightforward. When we eat the plant, or an animal that ate the plant, all we're doing is breaking the bonds that we formed, right, through that original energy transfer. So we're just simply moving energy through, right? We're not creating energy because we ate something, or destroying energy because we ate something. Like all we're doing is releasing energy that we had held onto for a short time. So energy can change from one form to the other, but it can never be created nor destroyed. The most common energy transformations that we see in ecology or ecosystems is the change of energy from something like solar energy to chemical bond energy, sometimes called the transfer of energy from kinetic energy to potential energy, and then back. Energy in the second law of thermodynamics tends to go from being concentrated to being more spread out. So things in a very simplistic statement tend to go from order to disorder, right? That's the second law of thermodynamics. So things go from organized to disorganized. So if you have chemical bond energy and it's broken, that's going to release the energy and allow it to spread out. All reactions transform energy from higher to lower quality. And systems tend to spontaneously increase this idea of entropy, where we go from being concentrated to being spread out. So just to kind of make sure you get it, here's how the sun enters an ecosystem. The sun is the ultimate source of energy for most ecosystems. There are some exceptions in deep ocean vents, volcanic vents and stuff, where the chemistry of the area provides the energy, not the sunlight. So if we just go back to those that are photosynthetic, remember this reaction series from biology? Carbon dioxide plus water gives us glucose and oxygen. Like that's how solar energy enters the ecosystem. So the fate of solar radiation looks like this. As the sun's light penetrates our atmosphere, this is kind of like where it all goes. 30% is reflected back into space immediately. 47% is absorbed by the atmosphere. 23% runs the water cycle. 1% drives the winds, right? Look down there at the bottom corner. Look at this, okay? 0.02% is actually captured by photosynthesis. That doesn't sound very good, but hey, at the end of the day, plants are doing just fine, and we've been okay. So unless there's something that like causes plants to need to increase their efficiency along the way, like this is what we've got. So the overwhelming majority of the solar radiation that we could potentially use for power here, photosynthesis, whatever you want to call it, like it just comes and goes. Okay? So after that, we got to look at how energy moves through the ecosystem. Now this is kind of like a warm over of biology, where we kind of got to talk about food chains and food webs. So if you're already 100%, 100 million% confident with food chains and food webs, you can pause, stop this video right here and right now. But if you want that review, here it is. So remember, plants are autotrophs, so that means they're an organism that can make their own food. They make their own food through photosynthesis. They use the solar radiation to produce sugar, and anything plant-like, plant-relative that does that, they're considered an autotroph. There are other organisms that don't use solar radiation in this way. They use chemicals. I mentioned them a while ago. They're called chemotrophs. If you have deep ocean vents, volcanic vents, this is a picture of a black smoker, which is a volcanic vent at the bottom of the ocean. Then the bacteria there don't photosynthesize. They live off of the hydrogen sulfide, which is in gaseous form at that vent opening. Now, heterotrophs can't produce their own food, so they got to eat. Then they use cellular respiration to break down those foods, those sugars that they've eaten, and extract energy from it. If you're a plant, plants also have to use that cellular respiration step to break down sugars. The main difference between a heterotroph and an autotroph is where did you get your food, right? Heterotrophs, like, they got to hunt down plants. Well, I don't suppose that's much of a hunt, but they got to eat plants and they got to hunt down other animals in order to get their food. Plants, they just sit there and absorb sunlight. Both of them have to do the cellular respiration thing, okay? So as we go through the list, there are some categories that life will fit into depending on how it makes its food and then subsequently what it eats. You've already seen the autotroph category for plants, so let's talk about some more of the heterotroph categories. If you're a primary consumer, you're an herbivore, right? Which basically means you're eating vegetable matter. You can also be a secondary or a tertiary consumer or heterotroph. If you're a secondary consumer, then you're a carnivore. You tend to choose to only eat meat. Tertiary consumers can be carnivores or omnivores dependent upon like the levels of your food chain, food web, right, that you're looking at. But again, usually a tertiary consumer's primary food source is meat. Omnivores can eat whatever they want. They can eat plants or meat. If you're a detritivore, then you eat decomposed plant and animal parts as well as organic fecal matter. Saprotrophs are organisms that are decomposers. They feed off of dead matter and soil, and this group are not detritivores, but instead fungus and bacteria that kind of finish off whatever the detritivores didn't eat. Now, using this information, we can create what are called trophic levels. A trophic level is a feeding level in a food chain or a food web. Food chains are simple, trophic level visual representations of basically, well, students like to say representation of who eats whom, but really it's a representation of how matter and energy flows through an ecosystem. A food web is a more complex diagram. I'm sure you've had some experience with these throughout the course of your biological careers. So with regard to trophic levels, this is how we might lay them out, right? An herbivore's plants are its food source, and something that might consume it might be deer. A carnivore, its food source is meat, and you got something like wolves that could be a carnivore. Omnivores can eat plants or meat, and a good example would be something like a bear. Scavengers, they eat dead stuff, carcasses, a crow, or maybe like a vulture. Detritivores, like those could be like ants, insects. Decomposers, well, they eat whatever they want that's died, and it could be something like bacteria, fungus. Okay. So that's how we would organize these by trophic level. Trophic levels also are important in terms of energy flow. So the only organism that gets a direct feed of energy would be the producer from the sun. Okay? So producers absorb the sun's radiation or the solar energy directly. And then as they go and do their life and growth and metabolism, they're going to use some of that energy for themselves. As they sit and live out their lives, unfortunately for them, herbivores might come and eat them, and as an herbivore eats a producer, some of that solar energy that they had in their bodies that they have not used yet would then be transferred to the herbivore. Now, if you remember biology, basically there's about a 10% energy transfer at each level as a result of feeding. So I could give you a ballpark number, energy number for producers, and you should be able to translate that up all the way to the top consumers by basically moving the energy in 10% increments. Here's another way to look at it, right? Remember, organisms are not 100% efficient. Only 10% of the energy available at one trophic level passes to the next. The 90% that's missing is released as heat or used by the organism that was eaten for its own growth and development. All right, so that brings us to some examples of food webs and food chains. So this is a pretty basic food web which shows the relationship between plants and some other Arctic creatures and then a man. Okay, so the idea here is, again, we like to look at these and go, oh, this is all about who eats whom, right? That's technically true, but if you use that analogy to focus on these arrows, you're going to have a problem. Because if you focus on it from the standpoint of who eats whom, and this arrow is pointing from like this caribou towards the man, that's kind of like saying the caribou eats the man. No, they do not. Instead, I want you to focus on these arrows, meaning where the matter and energy flows. Matter and energy flows from the caribou to the man when the man eats the caribou. That's how it works. So a food web has lots and lots of connections in it. The more connections they have in them, the more stable they become. Usually, regardless of the connections they have in them, they usually don't have any more than 3 to 4 levels. After that fourth level, that fourth trophic level, there's basically not enough energy left available being transferred from one level to the next to support, any life. So that's why they basically, kind of like die out after that fourth level. And these food webs, they could get crazy complicated. Like, look at this one. Crazy, crazy, crazy complicated. Now, aside from you being able to understand what's going on here with regard to matter and energy flow, I also want you to be able to look at a food web and ask a very simple question like, hey, what would happen if there were no more grasshoppers, right? What would happen if this hare, this rabbit, was eliminated? Okay, and I want you to be able to extrapolate out and predict what would happen to the matter and energy flow. What would happen if humans came in and said, you know what, this area is beautiful, I want to build my house here, so I'm going to start like covering this grass, with asphalt and concrete and build my house here, right? What would happen to life as you know it? And you should be able to predict that certain populations will go up, certain populations will go down. It's kind of like a short-term response to that kind of environmental impact, but long-term, the entire ecosystem will probably collapse. All right, here's some terminology. Okay, so if you didn't get it into your notes before, remember, photosynthesis is at the base of all ecosystems. Photosynthesizers, usually plants, the producers, that's this group at the base. Their productivity in an ecosystem, it's the amount of biomass produced in a given area during a given period of time, right? So when we're looking at net primary productivity, gross primary productivity, like that's how this translates out. We're looking at how much biomass has been produced in a given area during a given period of time. It helps us understand the health of the ecosystem and what impacts humans or other organisms are having on that ecosystem. So photosynthesis is described as primary productivity because it's the basis for all other growth. There's another type of productivity besides gross and net, and that's secondary productivity. Secondary productivity is the actual manufacture of biomass. So if you think about secondary productivity, it's technically talking about respiration in that equation I gave you a while ago, because respiration is the process that, releases energy from our food, so that we can build biomass, right? That's what it's all about. Here's some text definitions of these things. Here's the food chain. It's feeding links in series. In the food web, it's lots of interconnected food chains. And then the trophic level, that's the organism's feeding status in the food web. And they can be herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and the like. Make sure you got it in your notes. All right, moving on. We can also move on from food webs and food chains to a little bit different graphic representation of what's going on in terms of matter and energy flow in an ecosystem. And that's where these trophic pyramids come into play. Trophic pyramids come in a few simple forms. You'll have an energy pyramid, a biomass pyramid, or a pyramid of numbers. And they're basically communicating the same information but focusing on a slightly different part of the ecosystem. Are we going to focus on just energy? Are we going to focus on like the dry weight of all the life in the ecosystem, right? Or, like, are we just going to focus on how many individuals do we have, right? So that's what those are all about. So ecological pyramids basically come in those three categories. Here's an example. If the organisms at various trophic levels of a food chain are arranged diagrammatically, they should form a pyramid, right? They should form a nice, like, normal, like, pyramid. Due to the second law of thermodynamics, energy has to be lost at each level, about 10%, right? So this example here actually has the organisms in kind of a flipped orientation such that your producer is mentioned on top. If you had 100 kilograms of clover, then that should support 10 kilograms of rabbit and 1 kilogram of fox, right? That's how that 10% rule would work. Here's another way to look at it. This is a biomass of hypothetical grassland pyramid. Down at the bottom, you see your producers. Your biomass is around 10,000 grams per meter squared, right? Which can only support about 1,000 grams per meter squared of grasshopper, 100 grams per meter squared of frog, and 10 grams per meter squared of snakes. Okay? Now you can use that biomass number to ultimately determine, like, numbers of individuals if you knew enough about an individual such that you knew how many grams that individual weighed per meter squared, right? So if you took that snake and you studied it to that level, measured it, weighed it, all that, then you could actually calculate how many grams of snake you have per meter squared and use your 10 grams per meter squared of biomass to determine, like, how many snakes should live in an area. Okay? So here's another visual representation of an energy pyramid. Your producers all the way up, your tertiary consumers up there at the top. Okay? One quick question down here at the bottom of this. Why is it beneficial for humans to eat lower on the energy pyramid? Look at this. Ask yourself that question. Why is it beneficial for us to eat lower on the energy pyramid? Okay? Now, logically, what you should be assuming is that the higher you go on the energy pyramid, the less energy is left available in what you're eating. Okay? So if we eat lower on the energy pyramid, it's kind of like us being these herbivores down here, right? We could be harvesting 10% of 1,000 kilocalories of energy available from the plants, as opposed to eating where we normally eat up here, right? Where we're harvesting 10% of just 100 kilocalories from creatures that have already eaten plants, right? So think of it that way. All right. So energy is lost within the food chain. That's pretty much a given as we go one trophic level to the next. Remember, we're going to lose energy as the form of heat, and each trophic level is going to use some of its energy for itself, right? So only 10% of the energy available at each trophic level transfers up. Again, that's why these are energy pyramids and not like energy blocks. All right, gang, I'm going to stop there. That's been your coverage of Chapter 5's Ecosystems and Energy. In my next lecture, I'm going to cover some biogeochemical cycles so that we can look at how energy flows in a much bigger sense. This is Mr. Kennedy. I'll see you next time.